This morning we're going to move on and begin a journey into the greatest sermon that was ever preached. It wasn't preached by Billy Graham, by Spurgeon, Calvin, Luther, Augustine, the Apostle Peter, or the Apostle Paul. It was preached by Jesus Christ himself, and it's called the Sermon on the Mount. His sermon begins with a section known as the Beatitudes, and this is what we will focus on this morning. Now, I'm sure some of you learned about the Beatitudes a long time ago in Sunday school or a Bible study, but it never hurts to have a refresher course. So the word beatitude means blessing. So Jesus begins his sermon by describing the life of those who are blessed. Now, before I get too far into this, let's go to the Word of God, and we'll read from Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 through 12. And the words of the New King James Version are on the screen. And reading from the Word of the Lord, it says, "And seeing the multitudes, he went up on a mountain, and when he was seated, his disciples came to him. Then he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you, and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." May the Lord's blessing be added to the reading and the hearing of his holy word. The way I'm going to approach this message this morning is to put myself into it. And I've done a couple of these messages before, and my prayer is that by giving what would sound like a first-hand account of someone who was there that day and witnessed the Sermon on the Mount, I hope that will drive home the importance of the sermon that Jesus preached so long ago. So for the rest of this message, I will be speaking as an older man who is looking back on his life and was just a young boy at the time when Jesus was preaching on that day. And he's looking back on his life and on that day in particular. And it goes like this. You know, my recollections are very few from the days of my youth. And I must say, for me, the earliest memory that I have is without a doubt the day when I was among the massive crowd. Now, before I get into all that, we all know that every generation has certain days that they will never forget. But nothing could compare to the day when my family packed up to see the great healer who was traveling through the region. Word had spread quickly throughout the land that a Jew from Nazareth was traveling around healing people, casting out demons, and teaching. So you can imagine the excitement that it generated when he came to our region. He called himself Jesus. One day, and I will never forget this, my family and I were by the Sea of Galilee, and there were people as far as you could see. And it was the most beautiful day that you could imagine. The sun was shining, a cool breeze was coming in off the lake, and there was just a sense of joy in the air. Even as a young boy, I wasn't really aware of such things at a young age, but I just felt different on the mountainside that day. Looking back, I can't even tell you why my family was there. I don't recall anyone in our family needing healing, but regardless of the reason, we were there, and we were in for a very good message. Jesus ascended the side of the mountain and took a seated position, which meant that he was ready to teach. And it was so surreal how a hush automatically went over the crowd at once. No one had to be told to quiet down. It was as if they knew this would be special. Now, being a young boy, I was just playing in the dirt, making drawings with sticks, so I'm sure no one thought I was really paying attention to the teacher, but I was. You know, kids hear a lot more than they let on, and I was no different. All these years later, looking back, what I remember more than anything was that the teacher didn't even strain his voice. You would think that he would have to project a little louder to be heard from that distance over all those people, but he didn't have to do that. His voice was the softest, most peaceful sound, as if he were using his words to call everyone to come to him. And when he talked, it was as if I was the only one there and he was just talking to me alone. Now, as a young boy, I have often lied to my parents, telling them that I couldn't hear them when they called for me, when I clearly did. But on that day, there was no denying that we heard the voice of Jesus. Everyone heard him. And to this day, I can still hear his words, and he was talking about blessedness. He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Now, as a kid, I didn't always understand everything that was said on that day, but I do remember being comforted by his words. And I didn't understand what poor in spirit means, but I do now. I know now that all of us are poor in spirit until Jesus comes into our life, and then we become rich in spirit. And it's odd how his words stayed with me until I matured and could understand them better. Then he said, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." At the time, my mind went back about a year when my uncle died unexpectedly, and my mother and father literally spent days crying for him. And at the time, all I wanted was for them to be happy again. I wondered if this man, if this Jesus, could bring comfort should our family ever lose another member to death. Then he said, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." And I could tell that my mother and father were not happy with the way that we were governed. Maybe you have better luck with your government than we did. But the governor was a harsh man, and it seems that the only way anyone could ever take governmental control was by force. Yet here was Jesus promising that those who were meek, that is, those who were humble and submissive, they are the ones who will inherit the earth instead. Under normal circumstances, I think my parents would have said this was all crazy talk. I mean, can being submissive ever earn a person the power to rule? But I was surprised that during the conversations on the way home, my parents bought into this. I didn't realize until later that the words of Jesus gave them hope that the world won't always be as terrible as it is now. You see, my family was like a typical Jewish family. We were not rich, and there were even days when we had to cut back eating, especially after the tax collector came to town. And hopefully you have better luck with your tax situation than we did. We knew what it was like to be hungry and thirsty, so Jesus' words hit home for our family, as I'm sure they did for others, when he said, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled." It was the perfect mental image to explain this feeling of finally being satisfied. We knew what it was like to be hungry for food, but hungering for righteousness, that was the hook that drew us in. Jesus went on saying, "Blessed are the merciful, and blessed are the pure in heart, and blessed are the peacemakers." And with each utterance brought to mind either a situation that our family experienced or a desire that we had. It was as if this teacher had been spying on us for the last 5 years, and he knew the exact words to use to catch our attention and to make us stop and think. As I said earlier, this day is the earliest childhood memory that I have, but it is a very good one. And it wasn't until many years later that I got a better understanding of who this man who was teaching on the mountainside was. For me, this was the first step in a long process. Now let me explain this, that first I heard his teaching on that day, and his words stuck with me despite my immaturity. Then it was 3 years later when word spread again like wildfire that the same teacher that we saw teach on that day was arrested, and he was put on trial, and the next day he was killed by crucifixion. That's also a day I'll never forget. Now again, I was only 3 years older than I was on the day at the Mountainside, so my parents would never have allowed me anywhere near the angry crowds, but still, it is a day I'll always remember. You see, late in the afternoon, there was a sudden earthquake, and the sky turned black as midnight. From my perspective, as a kid, it was memorable, like when you get to witness an eclipse or a comet that passes by. But soon enough, things turned back to normal, and I went on with my life. I did have enough sense at the time to ponder in my mind why such a peaceful man would be treated the way they treated Jesus. That just didn't make sense. And it's funny how things like this are still fresh in my memory, even though they took place so long ago. But on the day of the earthquake, the words from Jesus on the mountainside came back to me as if they were written on the tablet of my mind. He said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God." And I remember thinking how Jesus was a peacemaker, so I guess that means he must be a son of God. And the odd thing was that afterwards, arguments began breaking out among the Jews about whether or not Jesus was the Son of God. Now, I wasn't always the sharpest tack in the drawer, but I noticed that most of the people who claimed that Jesus was the Son of God tended to fit the description that Jesus gave on the mountainside. What I mean is that many who clung to faith in this man, those who called him a Son of God, were poor in spirit, meaning they lived mournful and humble lives and good lives. They were merciful people who loved peace. On the other hand, those who denied that Jesus was who he said he was were the exact opposite. They tended to be arrogant, violent, rude, and they lived their life without a care in the world. There were even men in the temple who fit that description. It was as if their hunger for power was threatened by this peace-loving teacher from Nazareth. It didn't make sense to me. These were people who were not at all compassionate towards Jesus. Some of them even said he deserved crucifixion. But when pressed for details as to why they felt that way, they always seemed to come up short of an intelligent answer. As I grew, I began to pay attention to what was going on around me, and I never forgot the words of the teacher on the mountainside. It was as if a tiny seed were planted somewhere in my heart. And later on, I had heard stories about a group of followers of Jesus. They were called the disciples. And some of the stories about them were not very flattering, but most of them were very praiseworthy. You could tell that when the disciples failed morally or otherwise, they were very sorry deep in their hearts for the things they did, and they always got back on track and continued to do good things. There was something different about these people. As I grew to be a man, things made more sense, and the word began to spread of the good works of the disciples of Jesus. And even after the teacher died, and there were rumors, by the way, that he wasn't dead, and that he was actually seen by hundreds of people after his death, but that's another story. His disciples were so dedicated to continue his work. Just like Jesus, the disciples felt the sting of persecution too. Stories spread about how they were wrongly beaten and imprisoned virtually no matter where they went. And the irony was that the more they were imprisoned and the more they were beaten, the more and more people joined this group of people known as people of the way. And it defied all logic, because when a person became converted to the way, they automatically became a marked man or woman. What people didn't realize was that these individuals were totally committed to their devotion to Jesus, for them to risk their lives every day. And that's precisely why people were drawn to the group. No one wants to be involved with others who aren't committed to something. And if they're willing to put their life on the line, That is total commitment. As I heard stories of the disciples being persecuted, the words of Jesus from all those years ago came back to my mind. Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. To this day I still can't believe that I witnessed such prophetic words being uttered, because his disciples were continuously reviled, persecuted, and had many evil things said against them. It makes a reasonable person wonder if there actually is something to this Christian religion. It made me wonder that exact same thing too, and I kept coming back to his words on that special day, and I arrived at a place in my life where I accepted Jesus Christ into my life and became what they had begun calling a Christian. My life has not been easy since I made the decision, but I look forward to the reward for me in the kingdom of heaven. In the meantime, I take comfort in the words of Jesus. His words are packed with truth, and his words will never fade away. I know that his words are true because once I gave my life to Jesus, I experienced what it was like to mourn but be comforted, to be merciful but still obtain mercy, and to rejoice at my persecutions. I can still remember that day on the mountainside so long ago, but if that memory would ever leave me, I will always have the joyous feeling that is born of the love of Christ that cannot be put into words. Let us now pray.